The desert swallowed it whole. A 1942 Willys MB Jeep, one of the most historically significant military vehicles ever built, was pulled out of decades of quiet obscurity, transformed into something that looked like it had been welded together at the end of the world, and then driven across the Namibian desert by Tom Hardy himself. And then, like almost every great movie vehicle in Hollywood history, it just disappeared. Where it went, who has it now, and how close it came to being destroyed completely is a story nobody has fully told. Until today. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle, Mad Max, Fury Road, and why it matters. Before we can talk about the Jeep, we have to talk about the film. Because Mad Max, Fury Road is not a normal movie, and it was not made under normal conditions, and understanding that is the only way to understand what these vehicles actually went through. George Miller conceived the original Mad Max in 1979 on essentially no money, shot it in Australia, and accidentally created one of the most influential action franchises in cinema history. The Road Warrior followed in 1981 and Beyond Thunderdome in 1985. By that point, Miller had built a mythology so dense and so visually specific that returning to it was either going to be extraordinary or a disaster. He spent the better part of 15 years trying to figure out which one it would be. Fury Road was in various stages of development from the late 1990s onward. At different points, it was going to be animated. At different points, Mel Gibson was still attached. September 11th happened and pushed it. The Iraq War happened and pushed it again. Floods in Australia turned the desert locations green. The whole thing felt cursed in the way that only projects that eventually become masterpieces tend to feel cursed. When it finally went to camera in 2012 and 2013 in the Namib Desert in Namibia, it arrived with a philosophy that was almost aggressively opposed to the direction the rest of Hollywood had gone. Miller wanted practical, real vehicles, real crashes, real desert, real consequences. The computer-generated imagery budget was reserved for sky replacements and enhancement work. The actual carnage on screen, the spinning war rigs, the flipping cars, the explosions that sent shrapnel in every direction, that was real. They built it, they drove it, they destroyed it in front of a camera, and they did not apologize for any of it. The vehicle fleet for Fury Road is, by any reasonable measure, one of the greatest collections of purpose-built automotive insanity ever assembled for a motion picture. Over 150 vehicles were constructed, not rented, not borrowed, built from scratch or so heavily modified that their origins were almost unrecognizable. The production designer Colin Gibson ran what amounted to a working junkyard and fabrication shop for years before a single frame was shot. And sitting somewhere in the middle of all of that, about as far from its original purpose as a vehicle can get, was a genuine 1942 Willys MB. What is a 1942 Willys MB? Let's stop for a second and talk about what a 1942 Willys MB actually is. Because if you don't know the history, you might not fully appreciate why using one of these as a movie prop is either an act of extraordinary vision or the automotive equivalent of using a Rembrandt as a doorstop, depending on who you ask. And I have asked a lot of people. The room is divided. The Willys MB is the standardized production version of what most people simply call the World War II Jeep. And I want to linger on that word for a second. Standardized. Because the story of how this vehicle came to exist is one of the better underdog stories in American automotive history. And it matters to understanding what George Miller's team actually got their hands on. The United States Army needed a lightweight, all-terrain reconnaissance vehicle in 1940 and issued a specification that was, by any engineering standard, almost impossibly demanding. The requirement called for a vehicle weighing no more than 1,300 pounds, capable of carrying a quarter-ton of payload, with four-wheel drive, a wheelbase under 80 inches, and a full-flat windshield. They gave manufacturers 49 days to deliver a working prototype. 49 days, to design and build a vehicle from scratch in 1940, without computers, without CAD software, without any of the tools that modern engineers consider basic necessities, just drafting tables, machine shops, and the kind of pressure that either breaks people or produces miracles. 3 companies answered the call: American Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford. All three submitted prototypes. All three were evaluated. Willys won the contract on the strength of their engine. Ford built them under license because the Army needed volume that a single manufacturer couldn't deliver alone. Between 1941 and 1945, over 600,000 were produced across both companies. The vehicle that came out of that process was one of the most consequential pieces of military hardware of the 20th century. Dwight Eisenhower would later say the Jeep was one of the tools that won the war. He was not being dramatic. The MB specifically, the standardized military version that unified the designs from both manufacturers, replaced the earlier MA in 1942. 4-cylinder Go Devil engine, 60 horsepower, 4-wheel drive with a 2-speed transfer case, a ground clearance that laughed at terrain that stopped everything else, capable of fording streams nearly 2 feet deep, climbing 45-degree grades, and operating in mud, sand, snow, and jungle conditions that destroyed more complicated and more expensive machines. It was simple by design, and that simplicity was the point. Simple things don't break in a war zone, and when they do, a private with a basic tool set and 20 minutes can fix them in the field. That philosophy is baked into every single component of this vehicle. Now, here is where the collector reality enters the conversation, because it is directly relevant to what Mad Max's production team was working with. A genuine 1942 Willys MB in documented numbers-matching condition today is not a cheap vehicle, and it is not a common one. Depending on originality, documentation, and restoration quality, you are looking at anywhere from $25,000 on the low end for an honest driver quality example to well over $60,000 for a fully correct, documented restoration. Hero vehicles with verified military history or significant provenance push considerably higher than that. These are not cars that are getting easier to find. Every year there are fewer of them. Every year the ones that survive are more likely to be in the hands of serious collectors who understand exactly what they have and are not particularly interested in letting go, which makes the decision to take one and weld post-apocalyptic hardware all over it either an act of genuine creative courage or the most expensive bad idea in recent film production history. George Miller's team clearly landed on courage. The Jeep, to its eternal credit, did not argue. How they turned a war relic into Fury Road hardware. The man responsible for what the Fury Road vehicles looked like is Colin Gibson, the film's production designer, and he deserves more recognition than he typically gets outside of industry circles. Gibson approached the vehicle fleet for Fury Road with a single governing philosophy. Everything had to make sense within the world. The vehicles couldn't just look dangerous and cool. They had to look like they had been built by people in a post-apocalyptic wasteland who were working with whatever they could find, and they had to actually function. That second requirement is the one that separated Fury Road from most other productions. These cars had to run, in the Namibian desert, at real speed, in temperatures that regularly exceeded 45 degrees Celsius, which for the Americans watching is about 115 degrees Fahrenheit, in sand that gets into everything, with camera cars alongside them. Real performance was not optional. If a vehicle couldn't actually move under its own power through genuine desert terrain at genuine speed, it didn't belong in this film. The Willys MB was selected and modified to serve as one of the pursuit vehicles in the Warboy fleet. The specific modifications applied to it represent exactly the kind of fabrication philosophy Gibson's team brought to everything. The original body was retained as the base because the proportions of the MB, short, squat, impossibly utilitarian, read on camera as something that belongs to a world with no excess. Nothing about a Willys Jeep is decorative. Everything on it is there because it has to be. On top of that foundation, Gibson's team went to work. Additional armor plating was fabricated and welded to the body. Roof-mounted hardware was added. The suspension was modified to handle the specific demands of high-speed desert running while carrying additional weight. The drivetrain was assessed and reinforced. And the whole thing was finished in the kind of weathering and paint treatment that Gibson's team applied to every vehicle in the fleet. Layers of color, grime, damage, and improvised repair that made each car look like it had already survived a decade of the apocalypse before the camera ever pointed at it. I want to be clear about something here because there is a persistent misunderstanding about these builds. The weathering on Fury Road vehicles is not just paint effects. Gibson's team used real damage, real rust, real wear, applied deliberately and strategically, because they knew that a camera pointed at a vehicle in harsh Namibian sunlight would see through anything fake. The Jeep looked destroyed because they worked very hard to make it look exactly that destroyed. There is a craft to that which most people never notice, which means it worked perfectly. The Namibia shoot and what the Jeep went through. Now, let's talk about what filming actually looked like. Because the Namibia shoot is one of the more genuinely punishing production stories in recent Hollywood history, and the vehicles bore the brunt of every single day of it. The production was based primarily in the Namib Desert, specifically in and around the Dorob National Park near Swakopmund. The location was chosen because it offered the kind of vast, featureless, visually extreme landscape that Miller had been carrying around in his head for 15 years. It delivered on that promise completely. It also delivered temperatures that made basic physical activity genuinely dangerous, sand that got into engines, cameras, and lungs with equal enthusiasm, and logistical challenges that would have ended a less obsessive production before the first week was out. Here is a number that should reframe everything you think you know about this shoot. The crew spent approximately 138 days in that desert, not shooting in a studio with desert backdrops, actually in the desert for almost 5 months. I have been on a beach in summer for 4 days and complained about it. These people were out there for nearly half a year with Tom Hardy and a fleet of apocalyptic vehicles, and George Miller pushing all of it harder than any of it wanted to go. Tom Hardy, who replaced Mel Gibson as Max Rockatansky, has been characteristically blunt in interviews about the experience. It was not a comfortable shoot. The relationship between Hardy and Miller became famously strained during production. Hardy has acknowledged showing up late on multiple occasions. Miller has acknowledged that the whole thing was harder than anyone anticipated. And all of that tension, all of that heat and sand and friction and exhaustion ended up on screen in a way that feels almost documentarian. The desperation you see on Hardy's face in Fury Road is not entirely acting. Some of it is a man who genuinely needed the day to be over. The Willys MB, in the sequences where it appears, was driven under those same real conditions. Not on a controlled lot, not on a stage with a fan blowing dust around for atmosphere, but in actual desert terrain, with actual sand doing actual damage to a vehicle that was originally built for a different war on a different continent 70 years earlier. Think about that for a second. A Jeep that came off a production line in 1942 to fight one war, surviving a film production in the Namibian desert in 2012 that was, by any honest accounting, its own kind of war. The Willys MB is nothing if not resilient. It was built that way on purpose, and apparently the purpose held. The vehicles that were destroyed during production, and there were genuinely many of them, were destroyed deliberately and on camera. That was the whole point. The ones that survived did so because they were either too important to the shoot to risk, or because the sequences they were assigned to didn't require them to end up on their roof in a sand dune. The Willys MB survived. That much is not in dispute. What happened next is where the story gets complicated and where the trail starts to go cold in ways that should make every film preservation advocate genuinely uncomfortable. Where did it go? When a production of this scale wraps, the question of what happens to the vehicles is decided by a combination of studio policy, production designer discretion, and the practical reality of what it costs to ship 150 heavily modified vehicles back from Namibia to anywhere useful. Warner Brothers, which distributed Fury Road, made a decision that was logical from a cost perspective and genuinely painful from a preservation perspective. The majority of the vehicle fleet was not shipped back to the United States. Much of it was dealt with in Namibia, sold, auctioned, or otherwise disposed of on location. A selection of vehicles deemed significant enough for promotional or archival purposes did make the journey back, but the fleet as a whole was not preserved as a collection. Now, here is where I have to be straight with you, because this is one of those stories where the honest answer requires separating what is confirmed from what is rumored, and I am not going to blend those two things together and pretend I'm giving you facts when I'm giving you forum speculation. I've seen too many channels do that, and it drives me insane. What is confirmed? A selection of Fury Road vehicles were displayed publicly after the film's release in 2015. Gibson himself has discussed the vehicle builds extensively in interviews and in the documentary that accompanied the film. Several vehicles from the production have appeared at exhibitions and automotive events. The Doof wagon, the flame-throwing guitar truck, has been displayed publicly and is perhaps the most recognizable single vehicle from the fleet. What is confirmed specifically about the Willys MB is murkier. The paper trail on the specific chassis is not clean in the way that, say, the Cobra Mercury from Stallone's collection is clean. There is no lawsuit. There is no auction record with a publicly documented hammer price and buyer. There is no Virginia Museum of Transportation moment where the car is sitting behind glass with a plaque. What the collector community, specifically the Fury Road vehicle enthusiast community, which is a very real and very dedicated group of people, has pieced together goes something like this. The Willys MB, after production wrapped, was among the vehicles retained initially by the production rather than being disposed of in Namibia. It made its way back into circulation through what specific channel is not fully documented, and at some point in the period between 2015 and 2019, it passed into private hands. There are forum threads on multiple classic vehicle and film car collector sites that have tracked what appears to be a matching vehicle appearing at a small number of private events and shows in Australia, which would make geographic sense given the Mad Max franchise's Australian roots and the production's Australian organizational base. The modifications are consistent. The weathering profile matches production photographs. But without a verified VIN trace and documented chain of custody, confirmed is too strong a word. Credibly rumored is where we land. The mystery, the trail, and where it is now. Here is what I keep coming back to with this specific vehicle, and why I think it matters beyond the collector conversation. The 1942 Willys MB was not built for movies. It was built for war. Real men drove these things across real battlefields and real danger. Some of them didn't come back. The vehicle itself survived, the way a lot of military equipment survives, through sheer mechanical stubbornness, and the kind of engineering that prioritizes function so completely that longevity becomes almost accidental. For 80-plus years, this specific Jeep existed in the physical world before a single frame of Fury Road was shot. It predates the Korean War. It predates the Cold War. It predates rock and roll, the interstate highway system, and the entire concept of the modern action movie. When George Miller's production team got their hands on it, they were not working with a prop. They were working with a piece of documented history, and they treated it the way Fury Road treated everything, by making it serve the story completely and without apology. That collision, a genuine artifact of the 1940s embedded in one of the most visually ambitious films of the 2010s, is what makes this vehicle different from most movie cars. The Cobra Mercury was built for the film. The Training Day Monte Carlo was built for the film. The Willys MB already had 80 years of history before Colin Gibson's team ever looked at it. Whatever was added for Fury Road sits on top of that history, not instead of it. If this vehicle is sitting in private hands in Australia right now, as the credible evidence suggests, it is simultaneously a World War II military relic, a Mad Max production artifact, and a Tom Hardy film car. That is 3 layers of provenance that almost no other vehicle on Earth can claim. The person who has it, assuming they know what they have, which is not always a safe assumption, as this channel has demonstrated more than once, is sitting on something genuinely irreplaceable. And if they don't know what they have, well, that is a story this channel has told before too. A vehicle with an extraordinary history sitting quietly in private ownership, while the world looks for it in the wrong places. It happened with the Fast and the Furious Lightnings. It happened with the Dirty Mary Crazy Larry Charger. It is apparently a recurring theme in automotive film history that the most interesting vehicles end up exactly where nobody thinks to look. What this Jeep represents. So here is where we actually are. The 1942 Willys MB from Mad Max. Fury Road survived the production. It survived the Namibian desert, the 45-degree heat, the sand, and Tom Hardy, which honestly might be the most impressive part of that list. It was not destroyed on camera. It did not stay in Namibia with the bulk of the fleet. Based on the available evidence from the collector community, it passed into private ownership somewhere in the Australian sphere of the production's organizational footprint, and it has not crossed a major auction block with verified documentation. There is no museum moment. There is no Roanoke, Virginia display case with a placard. There is a credible trail that goes warm and then goes quiet, the way these trails always seem to go when the vehicle in question ended up somewhere private and the owner either doesn't know or doesn't want the attention. If you are watching this and you have a credible lead, and I mean a credible lead, not a third-hand forum post, but actual documentation or direct knowledge, the comment section is right there, open, waiting. This community finds things. The furious garage guys found 2 lightnings that were 20 years into invisibility. Someone out there knows where this Jeep is. Someone always does. What I can tell you with certainty is this. The vehicle deserves to be found. Not because it is worth a significant amount of money, though it almost certainly is. Not because it belongs in a museum, though an argument for that is not hard to make. But because the story of a 1942 military Jeep that went from the factory floor to a World War II service record, to 80 years of civilian life, to the Namibian desert, to Tom Hardy's hands, to the post-apocalyptic mythology of one of the greatest action films ever made is a story that should have a known ending. Right now it doesn't. And that bothers me in a way I genuinely cannot explain, which is probably exactly why I make this channel. If this one hit different for you, drop a comment below. Tell me which Fury Road vehicle you think deserves its own deep dive, because this fleet has more stories to tell, and we are just getting started. Like the video, subscribe to American Muscle, and we will see you in the next lane.